because it's a little bit pricey if this is what you're getting it for, but it actually can work. Oh, I got really fine shreds here. Now I do have this set up as a front intake, so you gotta be careful not to, suck that in. But things could get cheesy. But it's quite good. Welcome to Machines More. Many associate this type of front panel with a cheese grater, but this is a computer channel after all, so we'll leave the tasting for another time. But this is Piave Vecchio, by the way, so it's fantastic on pizza and finishing pasta, so highly recommended. So I hope you are enjoying the festive season. Best wishes to you and yours. We're getting close to the end of the year. Still, there's plenty of time for something fun, though, and this is the small form factor, the McPrue's Apollo S 4.0. I'll admit, I don't actually know too much about this company. By their own description, they are simply a boutique peripheral manufacturer from China. So there's no bio or even the slightest more specific geographic detail. But, judging from this case, these guys are pretty legit. And also judging from the finish quality on this, I must speculate if they are involved with something slightly more cosmopolitan than lower volume PC cases, but I won't speculate any further. Today we're just going to dive into my experience with this case. I'll tell you about the build, the setup here, some recommendations, and we'll look at some quick performance metrics. Full disclosure, I did receive this Space Black test sample from McPrue's for the purpose of making this review, but I am not paid or sponsored by them in any way, and you can expect objective and independent feedback as always with all the reviews on this channel. So please make sure you give a like and are subscribed for more content like this. McPrue's Apollo S 4.0 comes in an otherwise unassuming cardboard box, measures 384 millimeters long by 267 millimeters tall, not including the 17 millimeter tall feet, and 185 millimeter wide. Rounds up to 19 liters and making it on the bigger end of what most would consider a small form factor chassis. High-end material here, though. It's T6063 aluminum, and there's only one front panel option, and this is the ventilated cheese grater pattern that is very much reminiscent of Apple's Mac Pro lineup, and even the anodization options are a match. This one is called the Deep Space Black, which, as I understand, unfortunately won't be available into the future, but there's also silver and a space gray. So if you are familiar with the Mac colors, these are the more business-like ones typically, and it would not be surprising if you looked at this and said, dang, this is, I didn't know that Apple was making PC cases, right? So bolt holes at the front with a mesh lining. Side panels are toolless. They click in with a feel that I can only describe as, M1 classic-like. Let's show you what's inside. On the inside, we have compatibility for mini-itx, mini-itx, or MATX motherboards. The official spec here is 158 millimeters of air cooler height, so something like a Nocto U12A or Thermalright PA120 is supported. SFX or SFXL power supplies. The power supply will attach to a bracket next to the motherboard. There's also a position 2 power supply cage mount that'll attach it to the front panel right here, although you do have to give up the fan there. And speaking of fans, this case has a side panel assembly that consists of 2 rails, and you can do a 240 or 280 if you use the side panel. To this, you can also attach the equivalent number of case fans. And at the top of the case here, if you have room between your graphics card and the top panel, you can do 2 140 millimeter fans, and they absolutely have to be 140 millimeter fans because the way the case takes fans is the panel is drilled from the inside, and then it's also tapped, and you would just attach the fans with screws to this top panel from the inside. So I'll get to it a little bit. It seems like it's nice since you don't have anything sticking out the top, but it also does have its drawbacks. The front panel does take a fan in the same way. In addition to a 140, though, you can also do a 120 millimeter fan there if you like. There are an extra set of holes for that option. And do realize that a power supply on the main board panel next to the motherboard, that's going to obstruct either fan just a little bit, but you can have a fan there. The case is set up to be an inverted style. That means your air-cooled GPU's cooler fans, they face the top, so it's kind of upside down, right? This is typically the best setup for a GPU's performance, since a card can easily draw air through the top versus the bottom of the case, especially when you have minimal feet like this. And since you do have about 85 millimeters of space to divvy up between the card and the fans, it's likely that you can still use a set of case fans to further help your GPU along. The max GPU length is 345 millimeters, and from what I can measure, you will want to go less than 145 millimeters in card width, since although there is physical space for more GPU, your power connectors and your cable, that's going to vary, right? So even this, with the bend, it comes pretty close to the side panel, so you do want to leave room for that. Either way, though, compatibility is fairly good, as you would expect for a case that sits on the larger end of the SFF spectrum. You have room for 3 2.5-inch drives at the bottom of the case, or a 3.5-inch drive if you can fit it, or you could potentially mount a few next to the PSU in this spot here, but in most builds, the 24-pin and other cables will obstruct that. In this test build, I'm using the Strix X670E ITX board, the Ryzen 9 9900X. Got an ASUS TUF 4070 Super up here, and thermal rate set by the new 155mm tall Royal Knight 120 SE, which I wanted to check out in this build. It's got one slimmer tower section and a thicker tower, which in the typical configuration with the thicker tower facing the rear of the case, actually saw some interference from the stock AC power cable, so I flipped the entire ensemble around, with plenty of room still to clear my G-Skill DDR5 kit underneath that thicker tower. And because we have the slimmer section here, it was actually possible to put a thicker fan right here and close up some of the gap between the cooler and the rear panel. And at first, you'll notice in some of my B-roll, I went with the Cooler Master Mobius 120 OC, but when I ran it, I was experiencing some growling noise with those, and hey, there's room, so the Fantex T30s made a lot of sense. So with this RK120, I could actually fit 2 T30s, and as you'll see from the thermal testing, that makes this air-cooled setup perform incredibly well. For the PSU, this is ASUS's low-key Platinum 850-watt SFX-L unit. Because of the unique way the fans install to this case, you may actually want to install this first. And this didn't actually start off as a sort of pseudo-white themed build necessarily, but I did want to check out Fantech's new M25 G2s, and I only have the 140s in white. So I figured, might as well just use a PSU, white PSU to sort of match up. And the fans are actually quite neat. They do attach to each other by means of a fan screw. It's not your traditional interlock like some other competitors have been making. Daisy chainable cable, and if you're interested in the RGB effects, they do have an infinity mirror, and they're actually relatively well priced. The 3-pack of the reverse airflow orientation 140s is only $30. Here I use the reverse orientation specifically because the top is an intake and the front is set up as an intake as well, and that just looks a slight bit better. Of course, on the front, you might be able to see it from the outside, so that argument could go the other way, but I think either way, you'll find something that looks nice. So one issue I did notice about the unique way the fans mount up is that the threads are not tapped deep enough for how long these supplied screws were. Now, I don't know if they were accounting for thicker fans, but my 25mm fans are still loose, and in fact, you could get around that by using a few washers underneath that screw, but that looks, surprisingly, the front panel fan was perfectly fine with the stock screws, same screws. So I don't know what's going on there with the, I don't know if it's a tolerances thing or if it's just a spec thing. But after you get the fans in, building in this case is not particularly complicated. I think most will just leave the top and the bottom panels in place. They don't come off easily. The bottom does have a little bit of a mesh section that you can take off for easier access. But you do have to decide where to mount your PSU. So there are a few options for the mounting that's adjacent to the motherboard. For SFX-L, you will likely want to go with that tallest or highest position, otherwise your cables are going to sit too close to your card. If you want more of an alternate cable orientation, you really can't do that with this case, unfortunately. Unlike your more utilitarian mainstream case brands such as the NR200. There also aren't purpose-built cable tie-down points, so you're going to have to be creative with how you manage your cables. Otherwise, it simply is an inverted traditional layout. It's just, like you think about your normal PC build and just flip that upside down, right? For the front panel I/O, this case only has 2 USB-C ports. So one's going to run directly off the USB-C header on your board, and the other one is a lower speed one because it's just converting your A ports header, and just an illuminated power button, which looks very Mac Pro-like, or kind of like the ones at the back of an iMac if you've seen those before. As mentioned earlier, I did encounter some difficulty with this dual tower and the position of the rear AC cable. The cable extends and then snakes around to the back, and then coupled with my power supply's plug orientation, it did have to do a sort of loop around. So I think a neutral orientation cable would have been more ideal there versus either 90-degree option. But when you're building, just get the board in, PSU, and your cables hooked up, do some cable management, and then you can install the card. Another thing I noticed about these typical fan screws was that they protrude above the fans quite a bit. And since I was already rather slim on clearance with the GPU, I managed to nick the card a little bit, which is slightly annoying. But the reality is you do have a lot of space here for the card. And even with a thicker card, this one's about 63 millimeters thick. Even with this, you can clear a 25 millimeter set of fans, right, with a gap there to spare, which is pretty critical if you want to do something like this when you're running dissimilar fans or possibly out of sync fans and you want to avoid turbulent noise. But overall, I think this can be set up quite nicely. The cable management is not a gimme. You're going to have to be creative, snake cables behind things and around things, and clean them up that way. Good news is there's a lot of space to do so. And at the end of the day, we're not talking in extremely space optimized 19 liters, because if right here, there's a lot of empty space, which if you went down the liquid cooling route could be utilized. But even with a 9900X, you really don't need to. So check out these thermals with a front intake, like I've set up here, and the rear exhausting air cooler. Your stock PBO for this on the 9900X, drawing about 163 watts here. This is a fantastic temp, considering the T30s are only running at 1200 RPM here. I've got the case fans locked down to an inaudible 800 RPM, so to say that the performance with this air-cooled setup is good is a little bit of an understatement in that context. As a point of comparison, the closest direct corollary is where I tested the Fractal Era 2 with the same CPU and GPU. That was with a 240 EIO, and there the performance was fairly similar, of course. They were using those stock AIO fans that were spinning at 1900 RPM for this data point, so much louder. For gaming, GPU-bound title here, 4K. Thermals are very good. The way the airflow works does favor the GPU, since we are running a rear exhaust, and we're allowing the CPU cooler to take in some GPU exhaust. The front intake does mitigate that somewhat, of course. The Era 2's cooler fans were running at 1400 RPM here, so it's not the same noise as this guy here, but just data point. It's the only other build I've done with the same CPU and GPU. I did set the GPU to the same exact RPM to get that, at least to get that equivalence there. The GPU temps in the Apollo S are significantly better. It would seem that the CPU temps are a little bit higher here, but the cooler fans are only running at 900 RPM here, which is barely audible. So if you cranked it up a little bit to more noise normalized levels, I think you're likely to see more similar CPU temps, but still with much better GPU temps than the Era 2. I did recently test the inverted M2 with the 9800X 3D, so not quite apples to apples, but we're full GPU utilization anyway, so we're just looking at that data point. And we saw slightly warmer GPU temps there. So all indications here, the thermal performance, it's completely from top to bottom excellent across the board. You could go liquid cooled, but if you can cool a 9900X with an air-cooled setup, there's an elegance here, plus it's just really synced up with the directional airflow from the vented front panel, and this Royal Knight 120 is working quite well. So another home run here from Thermalright. So I would recommend this airflow direction for a more practical reason. You could of course go the opposite direction and rear intake and front exhaust, but from a more practical perspective, Typically, folks don't like the warm air directed at them, and since this is likely to be, more of a system that's placed on a desk next to the user, that's sometimes going to cause some inconvenience. All right, pros of the case. First off, the finish quality. It's excellent. As a whole, this is probably the best finish quality I've seen in an SFF case to date. Not only does it have that Mac-like quality about it, the tolerances are extremely good. The panels line up precisely. It isn't perfect, though. There were still a few drilled holes on the side panels where some anodization was not perfect and even missing, but I did have to be really looking for those to find them. Touch points are all good. I like the toolless closure. Details like the polished feet here. The finish on the PSU cages. This is something where even your nice level of SFF case ignores. And I think first and foremost, this is a looks forward piece of precision machinery. As you've seen, the performance is also first rate with the thermals. There aren't too many ventilated front panel SFF cases out there. When set up properly, the performance and the compatibility is quite good. It is a dimension that is spacious enough to work in without being cramped, and I think 158 millimeters is going to cover a wide swath of good air coolers. Cons, for something this big, I would appreciate some flexibility for the motherboard position. Not for the MATX, but for the ITX board, this is something the M2 does really well because you can kind of shift that up and down. I didn't find the position problematic necessarily, but it can help if you're optimizing for something, or just, if you're trying to fit something up here, you just want to shift it down because you don't need all this space here. That flexibility can absolutely help. The position of the power supply is not as flexible as I'd like, and at least as of right now, there's no bracket for an ATX power supply either. So I'm not entirely sold on the fan mounting method up here. At a minimum, I would have appreciated screws of the correct length for those top fans, and I would have appreciated just having 120 millimeter mounts as well. Perhaps you have a set already and you want to build this, right? Now you had to get new fans. Likely not an issue considering how expensive this is, but every little bit counts. By design, the front panel I/O is slim. There's no A ports, and it is on the top, so you're probably not going to want to use it too much because you got this because it's streamlined, right? So why ruin that aesthetic? But it is something to note, right? There's just two C ports there. Finally, there's no documentation for the case. If you join their Discord channel, there's some diagrams there, but I pretty much think you just get this case and some accessories. At least I didn't find a manual. I think a first-time builder could mostly manage, but likely not without some hand-holding. Some internal cable management points would be a consideration for a future revision, and like I mentioned, you can absolutely make it work. And in fact, the spacing between the main tray and the removable side panel underneath the motherboard is quite generous, but given how nice the case is overall, my view is that was a slightly overlooked aspect. It is a bigger case too. The M2 with a greater panel can do what this does, say for the cooler clearance, so the McPrue's, it's not quite as space efficient, so be aware of the dimensions. But I guess it's work of art too, right? And the pricing absolutely reflects that. Anywhere from $440 to $450 US, depending on the finish option, with shipping included to quite a few places. I think it's included for the US at least. And that puts it well and above most SFF cases that you might have seen or are considering. For example, the N case M2 can be had for less than $200. With already very good finish quality plus more flexibility. Now don't get me wrong, this case is extremely good, but perhaps the finish quality, it's a bit beyond what is necessary for most folks, and that, diminishing returns, right? So I think for many users, the budget would make more sense getting something like the M2, and then getting a better CPU or better GPU or something along those lines. 250 can get you quite a bit more mileage there. If you're a fan of Apple products, or maybe after a special MacIntosh build, if folks are still doing those, or you're just after utmost precision machining, absolutely recommend this case. As many of you know, there is a 168mm version of the N case M2 in the works, so I'd perhaps wait and see how that pans out relative to this one. But, pricing with this one, it's absolutely going to be in a level of its own. But like I said, if you want the perfect or almost perfect case, I think this one's highly recommended. So if you enjoy this build, probably will tinker with this one a little bit more, maybe even with a custom loop. So stay tuned. Please make sure you are subscribed, and please give a like if you enjoyed it. Links are down below. Big thanks for watching. pretty nutty.